Today, we'll be covering stakeholder analysis and health impact assessment. And my goal is to show how both approaches complement each other and helping us understand not only the politics around a policy, but also its real health consequences. In this session, we have three main objectives. First, to learn about the role and applications of stakeholder analysis and HIA in policy analysis. Second, to walk through some of the key steps and procedures analysts follow in conducting these assessments. And finally, we'll discuss the advantages and limitations of each approach so we can think critically about how to apply them in practice. Let's start with stakeholder analysis. So Varsovsky and Brugge define it as a tool or a set of tools that generate knowledge about actors, whether they're individuals or organizations, and the aim is to understand their behavior, intentions, interrelations, interests, so that we can assess the resources and influence they bring to decision making or implementation. In short, stakeholder analysis helps us figure out who matters in a policy space, why they matter, and how they can influence outcomes. When conducting stakeholder analysis, there are a few preliminary questions we may ask ourselves. The first is the aim. So in policy analysis, our focus is on the feasibility of different policy options. And in health management, the focus might shift to the success of an organization, like building alliances or mitigating threats. And in project management, it's even more different. The focus is on the success of a specific project, such as gaining support for design, implementation, or evaluation. The second question is time. Do we need a short-term rapid appraisal, which is useful for local projects with a limited number of stakeholders? Or do we need a long-term detailed assessment of positions, interests, and networks? The time frame shapes the depth of our analysis in this respect. The next two considerations are context and level. So context matters because managerial, administrative, and political cultures differ depending on where the policy is unfolding. So including a diverse set of informants can help capture these perspectives. Meanwhile, level refers to where stakeholders operate. Generally, we understand this to be the national, state, regional, or local levels. For example, in HIV policy, we might see federal agencies setting funding rules, state agencies running Medicaid, and local organizations delivering services. Mapping stakeholders across these levels gives us a full picture of who influences what. When preparing for a stakeholder analysis, it's important to think about who is conducting this analysis. For example, insiders, the people directly involved in the policy organization, bring valuable context and knowledge. They understand the culture, day-to-day realities, and can help us in that way. But relying only on insiders can introduce bias. Meanwhile, outsiders or those with vested interests can provide a more neutral perspective and challenge our assumptions. A mixed team, both of insiders and outsiders, is often the best approach because insiders bring the depth that we need, while outsiders balance the process by pointing out blind spots. Once preparation is complete, the next step is identifying stakeholders, and stakeholders are defined as actors who have an interest in the issue, are affected by it, or who, because of their position, may have the ability to influence decision making either actively or passively. So I understand that this definition is broad, but in that respect, it can include patients, policymakers, advocacy groups, providers, funders, and many more, but it helps us contextualize who we are talking to. Let's discuss the stakeholders in the Congress. And when we ask who makes health policy in Congress, the answer is not simple. Oversight of federal health programs is divided by more than 24 committees in the House and Senate, so please pause and use this slide as a resource to see which ones. But let's look at 3 committees in each chamber that play the most central roles. In the House, the Ways and Means Committee handles Medicare Part A and tax-related health policy, while Energy and Commerce oversees Medicaid, the FDA, NIH, and the CDC, as well as sharing jurisdiction over other parts of Medicare. The Appropriations Committee then decides how much funding actually goes to these programs. In the Senate, the Finance Committee controls Medicare, Medicaid, and much of the Affordable Care Act, while the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee is responsible for the Public Health Service and related agencies. As in the House, the Senate Appropriations Committee allocates annual funding through its Labor HHS Education Spending Bill. So while leadership figures like Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and House Speaker Mike Johnson shape the political agenda, it is really these key committees that drive the details of federal health policy. Here we see the next step, which is linking the policy issue to its stakeholders. For example, if the issue is HIV care, stakeholders can be connected to different aspects, including production of medication, the availability of that medication, regulations influencing access, treatment, and care, public campaigns, or even advertising. By mapping these relationships, we start to see how individuals, organizations, and networks interact around the policy issue. This mapping can be done in 2 main ways. First, analysts map out stakeholders around each component of the policy issue. This gives a structural overview. And then secondly, analysts can use snowball sampling through interviews. This means that one stakeholder identifies others who should be included in the analysis. Combining mapping with snowballing ensures that you don't miss key actors who might be less visible at first glance. Stakeholder analysis draws from 2 types of data. Secondary data includes published or unpublished reports, policy documents, internal regulations, and legal cases, as well as other information. These provide background and context, whereas interview data comes directly from key stakeholders and experts and offers insights that documents alone cannot capture. Using both together gives a more complete and balanced picture. The final step is organizing everything into a summary table. This table includes characteristics such as the stakeholders' involvement, interest, and influence, along with whether they support or oppose the policy, and how the policy impacts them. Inputs from this table come from both primary data like interviews and secondary data, and the summary table helps visualize stakeholder positions, making it easier to analyze patterns and plan engagement strategies. On this slide, we see an example of a stakeholder characteristics table in which each stakeholder is analyzed for their involvement, interest, influence, or power on this issue and the impact of the issue on them. Let's look at the first row, which is the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, which is highly supportive with high involvement but has relatively low influence. Meanwhile, the Association of Spirit Producers at the bottom has high influence but is opposed. This kind of table helps us quickly see where stakeholders stand and how their roles differ. Another way to organize findings is through force field matrices, which help us visualize shifts in power and influence over time. Here we can see where stakeholders currently stand on terms of their level of support and influence, and then project how that balance may shift in the future. For example, a group that is currently non-mobilized could become supportive with the right incentives, while powerful industry groups might increase opposition if new regulations threaten their interests. Now let's move on to health impact assessment. And Colin Fielding defined it as a combination of methods used to formally examine the potential health effects of a proposed policy, program, or project. Importantly, it's not just about healthcare, it's about how policies in all sectors, like transportation, housing, or labor, can affect population health. HIA also creates opportunities for collaboration across sectors and helps us pursue the goals of health promotion more efficiently. The purpose of HIA is to help policymakers see health beyond healthcare, which means factoring in social and environmental determinants such as housing, jobs, or pollution, as well as considering the costs of inaction. And HIA integrates evidence, stakeholders' concerns, and community perspectives into decision-making and projects health effects over time. If we ignore these broader health impacts, we risk missed opportunities and worsening outcomes in the long run. HIAs follow a set of structured steps, from screening to monitoring and evaluation. And screening asks whether an HIA is needed and feasible. Scoping defines which health outcomes and populations to consider. Assessment involves collecting data, both quantitative and qualitative, to predict health impacts. Recommendations are then developed to enhance positive impacts and mitigate negative ones. And reporting shares findings with policymakers and other stakeholders. Meanwhile, monitoring and evaluation, which is an ongoing step, tracks whether the HIA influenced decision-making and outcomes. There are three main types of health impact assessment. Quantitative or analytic emphasizes the risk analysis and provides objectivity, but can be limited by lack of data and are often time and cost intensive. Meanwhile, participatory health impact assessments emphasize stakeholder involvement, increased legitimacy and representation, but sometimes they lack common metrics or overlooked long-term impacts. And thirdly, procedural assessments are mandated by regulation and ensure transparency and consistency, but can become bureaucratic and less responsive. Each type has its trade-offs depending on the context. It's important to note that health impact assessments are not always feasible. Several challenges come into play, whether there's clarity on the goals and expected health impacts, whether data are available and usable, the cost in terms of time and money, as well as political feasibility, and this means whether the policy context allows enough space and time for an HIA to make a difference. Ultimately, these should provide new or previously unrecognized information that helps policymakers make better informed decisions. This slide illustrates how health impact assessments link policy components to health outcomes. This is a logic framework that uses transportation policies as an example. So we can see how transportation policies affect motor vehicle use, neighborhood safety, and social capital, for example, and in turn, these influence exposures like air pollution, noise, and stress, and shape physical activity, injury risk, and access to services. Using frameworks like these helps us map the causal chain from policy decisions to social determinants and finally to health outcomes. The World Health Organization has developed this framework that it helps incorporate health impact assessments into environmental impact assessments. And this is useful because many policies already require environmental assessments. Integrating health into these allows for a more comprehensive approach. The WHO framework lays out stages from screening and scoping to appraisal, reporting, and monitoring, which emphasizes stakeholder participation throughout the process. It gives you important questions to ask and questions that are needed, and it's an overall very useful resource that I encourage you to check out. This approach ensures that health is systematically considered in major projects and policies. HIAs face both institutional and technical challenges. Institutionally, there may be limited political interest or capacity to conduct health impact assessments and not enough trained analysts. Technically, health impact assessments require high quality and timely data, which may not always be available, and they can be costly and time intensive. But as Dannenberg emphasizes, a successful health impact assessment is one where its findings are taken seriously by decision makers and actually inform the development or implementation of policies and programs. Thank you for this lecture, and I'll see you at the next one.